Hey there, everyone. Today I am debuting my top 200 prospects list. This is going to be a list of players that I think are the top prospects rather than just taking OSA's word for it, essentially. I think this is a lot more reliable when you're just starting out a live game, as it takes into much better account the raw talent of these prospects. Now, this has nothing to do with how hard they are to acquire, nothing to do with how well the game views them. It's all about how good they are, how likely they are to pan out, and just their overall impact on your team. So we've got four classes here. Class 1 prospects are your bona fide superstars, the players that are just miles better than everyone else in the farms. Class 2 prospects are the perennial all-stars, prospects that you expect are going to pan out quite well and be some of the more productive regulars in baseball. Your Class 3 prospects are above average producers. This is essentially all the prospects that you can expect or hope are going to become good, productive regulars, but the odds that they become a superstar isn't too high. The odds that they bust is significant. There's a lot of difference between the best players here, the ones who are pretty much on the border of being all-star caliber, and the worst ones who are close to being nobodies. And then towards the very bottom of the list, we've got the Class 4 prospects who are essentially the nobodies. These are the prospects that have some value. There's obviously more than I've got on the list here, but they're not really likely to be too much. And these are the best of this category. I'd say everyone who cracks the top 200 prospects list is a meaningful prospect in some way, but there are really not that much more outside of it. And once you really get past the first couple of prospects in category 3, like the 50 range, once you get past there, the prospects, there's only a couple that I would consider meaningful overall. So that's something you got to consider with that as well. But anyways, on to just a quick breakdown. We've got, of course, number one prospect, Wander Franco. That's really no surprise. He is miles better than every other prospect in the game. He's the type of player that can outlast the fictional players that come into the game after a little bit. He is just incredibly talented, defensively at third base, and of course offensively as well. Now, Mackenzie Gore is, of course, nowhere near the level of Wander Franco, but I still feel like he's miles better than the third best prospect. So I'm still grouping him in a category with him just because those two prospects are the best respective hitting and pitching prospects available, and it's not even close. Gore is the best pitching prospect in the game. He's got stuff, movement, and control, elite stuff in particular. He is definitely going to. I mean, he's got ace caliber potential, which no other pitching prospect in the game could say. He's more likely to just be an upper rotation guy than an ace, but he's still quite solid. The best Class 2 prospect is Jared Kellnick. He is overall a quality power hitter with solid outfield defense and base running. He can turn into one of the better regular corner outfielders in the game. He's not going to win MVP in many saves. He's not going to be a superstar, but he could be a star player. Pavin Smith will be the number 4 prospect on this list. Another MLB-ready player. Pavin Smith, really the first MLB-ready player on the list, actually. Pavin Smith is ready to immediately step into your lineup and be a productive regular. He can field at either quarter outfield spot pretty well. He's a good first baseman defensively as well, adding a little bit of value with his glove. Uh, he, of course, has some of the better on base skills of any prospect and can be a productive regular even once you start getting fictional players piling in, which makes him quite valuable. We got JJ Bliday next. I think Bliday is essentially just a weaker Kellnick. There's a pretty big drop off between each spot in the prospects list between Gore, Kellnick, Smith, and Bliday. But Bliday is still quite a good prospect. I personally like him, and I think he's quite talented. He can be relatively easily acquired from the Marlins and turn into a very solid regular. Josiah Gray will be the number 6 prospect. This is really where the drop-offs start to get a little bit smaller between each level. Bliday to Gray is just not nearly as big. Gray is still an upper rotation caliber pitcher. His really only weakness is the stamina. He's got decent movement and really high control and stuff. Quality prospect. Adley Rutschman will be down at number 7 here. He is a little bit like Bliday, a little less on base ability, but he is, of course, a catcher, which brings him a lot of value. He's not bad defensively at the position. I mean, he's not my ideal player at catcher, but he is still solid. Andrew Vaughn will be 8th. He is essentially a slightly worse version of that power hitting profile as well. His defense is going to drag down his value. Overall, I think a good player to compare him to is Pavin Smith. He gets more power but gets on base a little less. The defense is less valuable, even though they're essentially the same defensive positions. And yeah, now we got Clark Schmidt here. Clark Schmidt is another one of those prospects that is really likely to be a top middle rotation starter. Now, of course, this is a big step down from Josiah Gray in terms of raw talent, but Clark Schmidt is also MLB ready to get started, which is a huge boost to his value, and he is higher stamina as well, a little less risky. Again, a really reliable mid-rotation starter in Clark Schmidt there. We also got Brendan Mckay. I think Brendan Mckay has become really undervalued after a rough 2020. He is now a completely developed pitcher who can step into the middle of your rotation and just produce. He's also, I mean, he's not a super great hitter, but he's the type of guy that you could stick in to give somebody a day of rest, to pinch hit every now and then without any real consequence. He is still a usable batter. So he's essentially one of those bench bats without taking up that extra spot in your roster. Next, we got another Rays pitcher, Drew Strotman. Now, this is a name that many of you have probably never heard before, and he is definitely on my list for one of the least valued prospects in baseball. Now, for those of you who watched the Foolish Baseball series with the Rangers, you saw Drew Strotman, you saw what he can do, and that is not an uncommon outcome for him. Strotman features really good stuff in home run prevention ability with not bad control. He is closer to MLB ready. The risk is not very high. He is a quality pitching prospect who's really statted and yet really not too loved by the ranking systems. So he's definitely a player that I would recommend you pick up in a majority of your saves, along with teammate Joe Ryan, who's down there at number 14, and we'll get to him in a minute. Next, we got Padres starting pitcher Ryan Weathers, who is another MLB ready pitcher. He's a little bit unorthodox. He's got really good movement and control to be the centerpiece of his skill set. He's got an okay 3-pitch mix that can produce decent stuff. He, with a good defense behind him, can be a productive upper middle rotation starter, which overall is about what you want from a top prospect like that. Now we've got the Tigers corner outfielder Riley Green. He's got a similar profile to the above prospects. He's like if you blended J.J. Bliday with Pavin Smith. He's got that power, a little less so than the top prospects. So he's also got an on-base ability, again, a little less than Pavin Smith. Not quite as effective, but the defense is also really good. He's a solid all-around prospect who can produce. He is, however, a lower minors prospect, so by the time he gets to the majors, you might be looking at a lot of quarter outfield prospects from fictional generation that are just better than him, but he's a good bet to be at least decent. Now we've got Joe Ryan, who's another prospect I think is on the short list for most undervalued in the game. Now, Joe Ryan's biggest weakness is he gives up a lot of home runs, but it's in a Justin Verlander style way. He gives up a lot of home runs because he gives up a lot of fly balls, but he actually doesn't have that bad of a home run per fly ball ratio at full development. And he also strikes out a lot of batters. He has some of the highest stuff of any prospect in the minors, about on par with Mackenzie Gore, maybe even better. And he does not walk many batters, so it's going to be a lot of solo home runs, but they're only solo home runs. He could still be a very solid, reliable mid-rotation starter. He's only about a year off from the majors. He's a quality prospect. We got the Phillies' Mick Abel. He's a power pitcher who's got really high stuff. He's also got decent movement and control. The upside overall here is pretty decent. And another prospect who kind of goes under the radar as a pitcher. Next, we've got Christian Poche, who is up here almost exclusively for the defense. He is easily the best center fielder defensively among all prospects of the game. He is one of the best center fielders overall in the game as well. Really great range. He's got strong air and a really good arm as well. He also has a decent batting profile. It's mostly gap-oriented, but he gets on base and hits for a little more power than the average player as well. Now, Royce Lewis, who is not a 22, but a second baseman and shortstop, he's usually going to end up at second base because he doesn't usually have quite enough defense to stick at shortstop. He's just a little lower than where I'd feel comfortable across the board with his defense, but he is a very good second baseman defensively. He's also got a pretty good batting profile. He's got solid OPS overall, a little bit of that power on base ability oriented profile, and while not necessarily an elite hitter, he can definitely provide offensive value, being a very good defensive second baseman. Brandon Marsh, another one of my favorite underrated prospects. He is a very strong potential hitting outfielder with another decent power profile, although he gets on base a little more than most of the power guys as well. And he's got solid outfield defense. He's likely going to be a starter, which means in a corner, but he could be a good corner outfielder. I do quite like Brandon Marsh's potential. Now, Elise Sanchez, another very undervalued prospect by the game. He's got really high catcher ability and a captive personality. Plus, his batting profile is a lot better than a lot of players up here. He has on base skills and he has a little bit of power. I mean, overall, Elise Sanchez is definitely the type of guy you've got there for his defense, but he's not going to kill you with the bat. He could be a solid bottom of the order hitter. Mariners starting pitcher Logan Gilbert. So Gilbert is nearly MLB ready, if not completely MLB ready at this point. He is a very good, well-rounded pitcher. He's got stuff movement control, everything about him. You got to love it. Solid player. PCA, another player I think is much better than a lot of people give him credit for. He has outstanding center field range. He is a lot like Poche defensively. Not quite as good, but he's also a lot younger and has time to develop his defense even further. And his bat, it's not quite as good as Poche's, but it's a little bit more on base oriented, relatively speaking, than Poche's. He does have a much higher ceiling since with his young age, he can build upon his potential and he is pretty well developed, so he is definitely a quality prospect as well. Definitely one of the better center field prospects, especially among the younger players. Now, CJ Abrams, I really wanted to rank him lower. I honestly am not a fan of CJ Abrams in out of the park baseball, but second base is just so weak, and the prospect core in general is just so bad that Abrams still manages to crack the second category of prospects. He has decent on base skills, particularly with his contact, and he can play pretty decent second base, so it's hard to rank him much lower. Now, Nick Allen, here we've got a shortstop who can bring some decent offense to the table, too. He does not strike out much. It's a decent on-base profile, and he's also quite a good personality. I believe a spark plug, so another nice prospect there in the Athletics, Nick Allen. Austin Martin, who is a pretty average fielder at second base. He brings offense to the table, though. He's got a solid on-base profile. Think of him as like a slightly worse CJ Abrams overall, Martin. He's also more versatile, which I didn't really factor into play with his ranking here, since all these guys are kind of going to end up at their top position. Martin doesn't play too well at third base. He doesn't play too well at shortstop. He's likely not going to be a regular at either of those positions. So while he could back them up, and while he can play outfield, he's really just best suited for second base. Now, the Nationals shortstop Armando Cruz is a prospect that has the ability to stick at shortstop. He is on-base profile, he is young, and he can really turn out. This is a guy you should be picking up 9 out of 10 times to be your shortstop of the future, really. He is definitely all upside without too much downside. There is risk associated, but even if he loses some of his abilities, his really worst case scenario is a lot like Steven Alamis. He's going to be a decent on-base second baseman with ridiculous defense. And yeah, that's really the downside, just a quality prospect. Emerson Hancock, he's got some really high stuff, decent control and movement. Overall, he's getting carried by the stuff. Puts him pretty high in the prospect rankings, though. Trevor Larneck, he's got a power hitting profile. He strikes out a lot more than most guys, unfortunately, and his personality is pretty bad. His upside isn't the best either, but he has a very good chance of hitting his potential and being a decent corner outfielder relatively quickly. Brian Hayes is not what you'd hope him to be in the out-of-park world. He's still got some pretty good defense. He's really just a developed Bobby Witt. He's a solid fielding or third baseman, a little better than Witt. He's got a decent bat, but it's really not even as good as Witt's. Hayes is just not as good a hitter as you'd like him to be, and that holds him back overall slightly. Although, again, being MLB ready kind of boosts his value. Vidal Brouhan, a very popular prospect in the OOTP world, and rightfully so. He's got a decent on-base ability, nice batting profile overall, and solid defense. He's like a slightly worse version of Austin Martin, who's more ready for the majors. Victor Basa. Now, this is a really fun prospect because the Marlins do not care for him. But he is a lot like PCA and Poche. He's a great fielding center fielder, and he can get on base at a decent clip. Overall, a nice contact profile, and yeah, Mesa is just a solid center fielder. He probably doesn't have as much upside as PCA. He's not likely to have the same ceiling, but he has a very safe floor and can, at the worst, be one of the better utility outfielders available. Now, Matt Manning is the first three-pitch pitcher on this list. He is above average movement and control and strong stuff, but the fact that he's a three-pitch pitcher kind of holds him back a little bit. He's still a strong starting pitcher. He is still MLB ready, and that helps his value, but he's not somebody I really love. The Rays middle infielder Carlos Colmenares, another Rays prospect who's just insane, despite nobody ever knowing about him, including me. I've never heard of this guy until I started making this list. And yeah, just a really fun prospect. He's got above average batting profile, carried by his on base skills. He looks a lot like Vidal Brouhan, actually, except there's a catch. He's got even better defense. Carlos Colmenares has some of the strongest defense at second base of any second base prospect in the minor leagues. He has, because of his age, the highest upside of any second base prospect in the minor leagues. Now, it takes a while for him to develop. The risk is there, but a very strong prospect you could get on the cheap. Get him thrown in with Joe Ryan and Drew Strotman. He will be well worth the gamble. The Diamondbacks starting pitcher JB Bukauskas. I'm not sure I want to keep him in this category. I might drop him about 10 spots on the next rankings list, but he's here for now, mostly because he's MLB ready. He is a power pitcher with a lot of stuff. He can prevent home runs at a good clip, and he doesn't give up too many walks. He is a reliable mid-rotation starter. He can't eat innings, but he can be a very good stopper as a worst-case scenario, really, for him. So Bukauskas is definitely a prospect that you should have your eyes on. Grayson Rodriguez, not as good as you'd be hyped to think. He does have really good stuff, and the upside is there. He is one of the most common pitchers to hit TCR and develop into a huge ace-type guy. Overall, that does rank him higher because of the TCR possibility, but he's got a really good four-pitch mix. He's got a strong slider. His normal upside is that of a mid-rotation starter, and he could reach better heights with TCR. Next up, we've got the Mariners outfielder Taylor Trammell. He is MLB ready, and he's above average across the board. He gets on base. He hits for power. He's a strong fielder. He's a captain. There's really nothing not to like about Trammell, and combine that with his MLB readiness, it's not difficult to place him in this category. He's a reliable player. We've got Tigers, first baseman, left fielder, right fielder, Spencer Torkelson. He's a lower on-base profile, but he hits for more power than just about anybody. The defense is actually very generous for him. I seriously doubt he's going to end up nearly as good as the game has him rated. He's not the worst, and he can develop quite quickly, but he's not really the best build for a prospect and not quite the guy that I would go for myself. I got the Blue Jays designated hitter Alejandro Kirk, and that is the sticking word here, designated hitter. Kirk does not have the defense to stick at catcher. He can be a first baseman, and he can be a DH. Now, there's no risk to his profile because he's MLB ready, and he's essentially just a worse-hitting Pavin Smith at that point. So he's a solid prospect. He can produce, and he's ranked 37th overall. Now, Blue Jays come right back with Simeon Richardson, who is another solid pitching prospect. He can go to the bottom of your rotation instantly, and really should in most cases. And he is got decent upside. He's the upside of a mid-rotation starter. Frankly, I kind of regret not ranking him above, say, Grayson Rodriguez and JB Bukauskas, because he's got some pretty decent upside with, again, a pretty solid floor as well. His floor is not too incomparable to Bukauskas, and his ceiling is maybe even a little bit better than Grayson Rodriguez because he's got the movement and control to go with his solid stuff. The Astros outfielder Chas McCormick is a player I think I might have overrated a little bit on this risk, but he is like a slightly less effective Pavin Smith who's really more of an outfielder. He's got solid defense, though. He can be a utility outfielder, the worst case scenario, but he could start in either corner, no problem, too. And really, the development is what lands him so high on the list. Now, the Pirates' middle infielder, Steven Alamis. He is a guy who's basically MLB ready as well. He's got average on-base skills. He does have a lower-end power, but he's also got the benefit of being an outstanding fielder. He is one of the best fielding second basemen of the game. He can handle shortstop if needed, and he can help your team immediately. Now we've got Bobby Witt, who he's got an incredibly inefficient batting profile. He strikes out too much. He doesn't get on base as much as you'd like, and he has really high gap power to cover his batting. But overall, he's still got very strong defense. He can be one of the better fielding third basemen in all the minor leagues, and since he does have a good amount of stats overall to his batting profile, he still lands pretty high on the prospects list. Dalton Jeffries, the Athletics starting pitcher, I like him quite a bit. He is my favorite three-pitch pitcher there is, aside maybe from Ryan Weathers, but really great prospect. He gives up power runs at a slightly high clip, but he does not walk very many batters at all, and he's got solid stuff. He could join the middle of your rotation immediately and produce pretty well. Frankly, I might have ranked him too low. Julio Rodriguez, a top prospect in real life, not so much here. He's like a worse version of Torkelson overall. He's not a solid prospect. I think I should have ranked Torkelson a little lower as well, but Rodriguez is going to come in there. And Drew Romo, who is one of the better catchy prospects of the game. His defense is a lot like Sanchez. He is a lower minor prospect at the point. He's got a very strong personality as well, also a captain like Sanchez. He's a decent hitter as well. Overall, the profile is about average, but it's actually the defense that holds Romo back. He's a slightly worse fielder than Sanchez and can't necessarily hold his own with the best fielding catchers in the game. He's still got the potential to be a regular and can grow, but yeah, it's not ideal. Now, I'm from here on out only going to talk about the prospects I think are the most important. Taylor Walls is one of them, another quality race prospect. They're, in my opinion, even better in OOTP with the farm than in real life. Walls is essentially like Brouhan with less offense but slightly stronger fielding. He is a little older and more risky as a result, but he's still a quality prospect. TJ Zook, he is MLB ready. I just realized I forgot to put his 2021 ETA. He can immediately be a mid-rotation starter, no fuss, and that's really all there is to it. Tousapita Marcano, a prospect I'd never heard of. He is a decent fielder at second base with a very strong bat. He is almost MLB ready, too. He could get on base. He can overall just produce for your team. And if you're desperate for a second baseman, you can't pick up one of the top players, Marcano is not the worst option. All right. Now we got Nasim Nunez, who I did not put a risk factor or ETA for, which is a mistake. So he's going to get a low moderate risk factor and an ETA of 2023. So Nunez is an elite fielding second baseman or a strong fielding shortstop. And the offense is it's a little worse than guys like Alois, but overall his fielding is even stronger. He is really rangy. He does not give up too much error or arm, and quality prospect. Luis Gonzalez from the White Sox. Like Chas McCormick, a little less developed, a little higher potential. I personally think Gonzalez is the type of player you pick up if you need a starting corner outfielder or utility outfielder and don't have one yet. He is cheap to get from the White Sox, another high-end potential guy. MJ Melendez, great prospect for the Royals, catching-wise. He's like if Drew Romo had slightly less ability, slightly stronger arm, and it had a more power-oriented profile. Not a bad prospect. Manuel Clase is the highest-ranked relief pitching prospect. Now, it's important to note that I did not actually rank that many relief pitching prospects, like maybe 4 or 5. That's going to change on future lists, and you'll note this by seeing that the top one is all the way up at number 59 with some of the quality prospects of the game. I personally believe that if you have somebody who could produce versus somebody who can't, it doesn't matter if the somebody who can't would be able to be okay if they got a role. Having a great reliever is better than having a mediocre prospect at another position. That's just my personal opinion. My future prospect rankings will reflect that. Clase is risky because he has a long ways to go, but he's still a very good pitching prospect, even if he doesn't fully develop. And he is ready to immediately be a high leverage reliever, even with so much room to grow. Brian Mata, coming off Tommy John surgery, but an MLB ready pitcher who can slot in the middle of the rotation and be a pretty solid prospect. Paul Campbell, another prospect I think most players are unaware of. Another type of guy who could just slot in the middle of your rotation, be a reliable starter from the get-go. Chris Rodriguez, another one of those middle rotation starters, and Terrin Vavra, another second base who is just not the best fielder but can really hit. So if you develop his defense a little bit, he can be quite a solid player. Otherwise, he's going to be a lot like I cannot remember the Cleveland prospect, but we'll get to him later, and then I will say, hey, remember Terrin Vavra? He could be a lot like this guy if the defense doesn't come. Sean Hagel, never heard of him before. I'm sure you haven't either. He is actually the guy who can immediately join the back of your rotation and develop into a middle rotation starter. He's got decent ratings. He's a 3-pitch pitcher who's among the better ones. Tyler Freeman, he's up here mostly for his personality. He has a decent on-base profile. He's a decent fielder at second base, but with a spark plug, he can really develop. He's most likely destined for a utility infield role where he will do quite well because of his personality, but he does have the potential to become a decent second baseman as well. Now, Daniel Espino is another pitching prospect who he's a lot like Grayson Rodriguez, honestly. The big difference here is that he is lower on the stamina and higher on the risk. Nick Robertson, another quality relief prospect. He's younger and less developed than Clase, but with about the same potential. Jose Devers, another strong fielder, and he's got a pretty decent batting profile too, a quality prospect for the Marlins. Matt Cantorino is another type of guy who could become a middle rotation starter with relative haste. I like those pitchers quite a bit. Michael Ciani is a good fielder and not the worst batting profile, but a solid personality as well. He could be a center fielder. He's essentially like the third tier option behind Poche. He's not your ideal choice to be a center fielder, but he's not bad either. Kremer's another MLB ready prospect for the pitching side of things. Aaron Bracho, that's the guy who's a lot like Terrin Vavra. He is very unlikely to work out at second base, but also one of the best hitting prospects at second, and can, if needed, become a corner outfielder with reasonable success. Kyron Paris, another quality fielding second baseman who can get on base at a good clip. Dre Jameson's a really weird prospect. He's a little older, but has really high stuff potential and decent home run prevention as well. So you could rely on him to be a decent pitcher if he makes his potential. Shane Baz usually has really high upside, but very high risk, so that's something you have to consider with him. Pedro Vila, another MLB-ready pitching prospect. Nick Bitsko is really interesting. I've noticed that he hits TCR frequently, or I should say more frequently than almost any other pitching prospect, and that is because he is very heavily developed for an 18-year-old prospect. He's also got pretty good potential in his own right, and it's a shame he doesn't crack the top hundreds list because he turns into an ace more pretty much out of the blue, I should say, more than anyone other than pretty much Grayson Rodriguez, and is a quality prospect even if he doesn't. He could be a decent mid-rotation starter. Yason Dominguez, it's a shame he ranks so low, but the batting profile is atrocious. He just does not get on base enough, and it's very gap power dependent. Trevor Stefan is a very interesting prospect, probably the most interesting profile on the list. Now, he's a reliever to start a game. He should be like a stopper type guy for your team. He's actually quite cheap to pick up from the Indians as well. And he can be a very quality pitcher in your bullpen. He can occasionally make it as a starter too, as a 3-pitch starter in the middle back part of your rotation. But more likely, he's just going to be a really strong reliever who can eat a lot of innings. So, like Corbin Martin as a stopper, but a little less effective. Now, Victor Mesa Jr., both the Mesa brothers making it on the top 120. It's sad he didn't make it to the top 100, but still, he gets on base pretty well. He's got decent defense. He's a good starter in either corner. Gabriel Arias is a shortstop. He's got an inefficient batting profile. It isn't quite as good defensively as he used to be, so he ranks a little lower, but he's still not a terrible option at short. George Valera is a good on-base corner outfielder. Cole Winn is an interesting pitcher for the Rangers. Solid prospect. Steele Walker, he gets on base a lot. He might be ranked too low. Same with the guy below him, Daniel Lynch. Those are both decent prospects. Well developed already with solid upsides. Cole Roederer is another decent upside outfielder. Jeremiah Jackson's pretty weird. He's a power-hitting second baseman with a mediocre batting profile, but solid defense. I think I might have him ranked too highly on this list, but he's not bad. I like Thad Ward a lot. He's a lot like Joe Ryan, but a little worse overall, and more home run prevention than emphasis on other things. Jake Makeup. This guy is just ridiculous. You should be picking him up to be your utility outfielder if it's not Luis Gonzalez. He's got solid defense. He gets on base, and he, with a little bit of development, can be a solid starter at the quarters or even sometimes in center. Braxton Garrett is a Marlins starting pitcher, so I'm just going to label that really quickly. Hudson Head is a Pirates outfielder with decent hitting potential just in general. He can be picked up pretty easily. He tends to get on the top prospects list pretty fast. Tommy Doyle, another reliever on the top prospects list here. Nick Lodolo is a solid 3-pitch pitcher. He has good control and movement, and his stuff overall is not bad either. He's a solid, well-rounded prospect. Bruce Zimmerman, another MLB-ready player. Livin Soto, he's a decent fielder who can get on base. Not the best at either, but he could overall be a solid player. Brett Conine, another power pitcher with a good arsenal, decent control, decent home run prevention. And I forgot to put his risk factor and ETA in, so I will do that really quickly here. Yohendrick Pinango from the Cubs is a really solid potential young prospect, in my opinion. Jackson Kowar, another MLB-ready pitcher. He's a little bit of a... He looks better than he is, in my opinion. He's a solid player, but not necessarily as good as you'd like to see. Hunter Green throws hard, but that's about the limit of his profile. He's got really 2 pitches that he relies on. The movement and control isn't as much as you'd like. Riley Gilliam, another reliever. He's solid. Hans Krause, another solid pitcher. Cole Wilcox is another. He's like Baz, but he's got higher control and a lot lower movement. He's got decent potential, but he's also a lot riskier than Baz as well. Dylan Dingler is an on-base oriented catcher. He's not a bad backup in most cases. Packy Naughton, a solid near MLB ready reliever, or starter rather, for the Angels. Kybert Ruiz, his defense is a shamefully low, but he's not a terrible prospect overall. Jefferson Caro, another guy who's probably a backup catcher more often than not. Jazz Chisholm, I think I might have ranked too highly. He strikes out way too much to be useful in a vast majority of games. Even if he develops his defense and offense a little bit, it's still very tough to get him to work out too well. Giancarlos Mejia is another solid guy who can just step into your rotation immediately and produce. It really is that simple. Justin Williams, MLB ready outfielder. He could turn into a decent player, but he looks better than he is as well. Jaron Duran, like the Diamondbacks, Alec Thomas and Corbin Carroll, but he's got a little bit more gap power, and he's not great. Slade Ciccone is a power pitcher who's got decent potential. Jimenez is pretty similar to Duran, I think. Pepe, it's a solid potential pitcher as well. Logan Allen has very high risk, but the reward is solid. He could be an above average stuff, super high control pitcher, probably a middle rotation guy, which is much better than you could say for a lot of the potential of the guys down here. And the number 200 prospect will be the last one I'll cover on this video. It is Gunnar Henderson. So he strikes out. He's not a good enough fielder at third without improvements. He doesn't really work anywhere else. He doesn't hit TCR too much, and he almost never works. So just not really a great prospect. I think Henderson is far and away the weakest on the top 200. And yeah, so if you want to check out this list for yourself, I think it's pretty good. With every prospect, I give a breakdown of their general abilities. I give how risky I think they are, which I did factor into how I ranked them. And I gave when I think they would come out, which I also factored into how I ranked them. The sooner prospects come up, the better. Like I said, that's mostly because fictional players tend to replace top prospects pretty quickly. Well, anyone but the top prospects, really, pretty quickly. And I hope this was enjoyable to you guys. I hope it's helpful. I hope this is a good resource to the community. So let me know if you have any questions. I'll try to update this prospects list as soon as I can, make it better. And yeah, I'll talk to you guys on the next update for this one.